So are you ready, Minister Joe? We'll jump into Genesis chapter 12.
Let's do it. This is pretty foundational to everything.
It is. The call of Abraham is really the beginning of well, it's not the beginning of the story of salvation, but you'd understand what I meant if I said it were, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really most of the scriptures, especially the New Testament, refer back to this as a beginning point. So this is chapter 12. I'm just going to read the first paragraph, and then we'll interact with what we see there. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So when you say foundational, that is indeed foundational. We haven't seen covenants made frequently in the scriptures to this point. Many say that it was a covenant God made with Adam and Eve when he said, "You can eat from any tree of the garden, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And he gave them the commands that he did: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and to subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, the wild animals, the livestock, and the creatures that crawl on the ground. Many say that that's covenantal kind of language. So that might have been a covenant, but we broke that one with the tree of knowledge. And then he makes a covenant with Noah, right? He tells them that they can now eat meat, but there has to be certain things. You can't eat meat with blood in it. And he requires the death penalty for anyone who takes a human life, right? But then he gives them the same command he gave to Adam and Eve: fill the earth, right? So that is a covenant. That's the first conversation God has with a human that is called in the text a covenant, officially. That is with all humanity. This is the first particular covenant that we see God making with somebody. This is not with all of humanity. This is with an individual. So we've gone from cosmic to a little narrower to now really specific. So that's how I wanted to open it. This is very important because it's this covenant that Jesus fulfills.
Right.
So what do you see here, Minister Joe? What jumps out to you in this first paragraph? I mean, these are some of the most quoted verses
Right.
1 through 3 in all of the scriptures, and so lots of scriptures later will refer to them. But
the first thing is I see a similar thing that's quoted in the garden about leaving and cleaving to one another. But for the very first thing is that God calls them by name. Calls them by name. It's not just like, hey, anybody come along. This is the beginning of the first wave of what I'm going to do. He calls him by name and tells him that he has to leave the country, leave the familiar. And
yeah.
I think one of the most powerful things that we studied when we were studying the Hebrews was the very fact that they highlighted the fact that Abraham's faith was something that was credited to him as righteousness. But what impacted me the most was that Abraham's faith had to grow. That there's a process that we'll see even more as we read further into the text. But there was a promise, but there was also a process of having to leave. There had to have been some resolution.
Yeah.
I think of that text in the Gospels where it says Jesus set his face like flint, whatever that means to everybody today, but
yeah,
toward Jerusalem. In other words, it was like there had to have been a resolution for him to say, yeah, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like it was some kind of epiphany or something. So, or it wasn't even like a burning bush like for Moses. It wasn't like, it was like all these animals came to him. God just spoke to him.
Yeah.
Leave your country and your people, your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. That to me is amazing.
Yeah. It's, when Jesus says in the New Testament, and I know whenever we deal with a passage like this, especially the life of Abraham, we're going to be jumping all over the place.
Yeah.
And that's to be expected because so many references come back to this story and this story full, but it reminds me when Jesus says that he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And he said, unless you hate mother, father, sister, brother, children for my sake, you're not worthy of me. Remember he says that? He's going to bring a husband against his wife, a mother against her children, siblings against each other. Like, the reason I think Jesus says that so starkly is that's the call of Abraham. He had to leave. And we're not talking about an emotional kind of hate. This is, again, Hebrew. And certainly there are always emotions, but the word sane in Hebrew, which is the word for hate, means to choose against. So when God says, Jacob, I loved Esau, I hated, it's not an emotional comment. It simply means he chose Jacob and he didn't choose Esau. That's all that means. And that's common sense. That shouldn't be a surprising thing. But Malachi doesn't intend that to surprise anybody. Right. We already knew that. Yeah, he chose Jacob. He didn't choose Esau. That's what love and hate mean. So when Jesus is saying that you need to hate your family, more or less, what he means is you need to choose God first. Even no matter what it costs you. Even if it costs you in that culture the most sacred of social security. Because family was everything. In these days, it was your safety, it was your future longevity, it was your protection, it was your wealth, it was your food, it was everything. So to ask Abram to leave is a big request. That's what I'm saying. No less big than when Jesus makes that comment about having to hate all these things you and I would never want to hate. So, and then not even to tell them where they're going. Right?
Do you think it was similar to what the rich young rulers came to Jesus? What do I do to need to inherit? It's like Jesus is saying to him already.
Yep.
You got to do what Abraham did.
Right. Absolutely. It's difficult. Like, that story is a challenging one, but very similar to Abraham. So in the rich young ruler, he's young. Well, we don't know that he's a ruler. They don't even say he doesn't even say it's young. He's just a rich ruler. But in order to have wealth in the ancient world, it's mostly inherited. Wealth is accumulated over time. And the way people become wealthy, for the most part, unless they're part of, royalty or something like that, they do it by accumulating, slow accumulation of wealth over time. So if he's here and he's wealthy and he's not a tax collector and he's not a king, then this is a generational type of wealth, most likely, that he's received. So for Jesus to say sell it all, it's not just a matter of selling his own possessions. This would be like asking one of the Vanderbilts to divest themselves of everything that their family's ever had. So he's giving away history. That is very similar to what Abraham's being asked to do. He's being asked to start over. And that's got to be difficult. Now, we already know, and we probably should have started with this, but we already know that Abraham's family was on its way out of Ur. So Abraham grew up in Ur. And Ur is one of the capital cities of the Sumerian Empire. As far as our historical resources go, and again, some of this is a little bit of conjecture, but it is informed conjecture, and it's pretty much the consensus, is that the god of the city of Ur was the god of the moon. And it's one of the Sumerian cities. So Abram is in a polytheistic culture, meaning that they believe in multiple gods. He originates from a city in which they worship the god of the moon. That was the god of Ur, as far as we can tell. And they had already left Ur before Abraham got this call. So this is verse 31. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. This seems to me a little known detail because we don't tend to read these genealogies very closely. But for some reason, Terah, Abraham's dad, was already determined to go to Canaan. So they leave Ur and they stop at Haran. And the text makes it look like when God comes to Abram and tells him to go to a land he will show him, they're in Haran at that time. So for some reason or other, they never finished the journey. And later in Abraham's story, it'll sound like God actually called his father, Terah, to go to Canaan, but Terah didn't go all the way. So it's an interesting little detail we don't talk a lot about.
Yeah.
But Abram here is, so his father began a journey that he didn't finish. He stopped in Haran for whatever reason. They named the city after Abraham's brother who died there. Maybe that's why they stalled. I don't know. Maybe that's why they didn't finish the journey. That's all conjecture. But God basically comes and says, Abraham, leave your father behind and finish the journey I've taken. I started you on. So that's probably important to say, because it's not as though Abraham was in Ur and settled. Like, they were on their way. They just got hung up. Have you thought about that, Minister Joe?
Yeah, it strikes me. It strikes me a little. Believe me, I wasn't really thinking about that as much, but reviewing it right off the cuff as a reaction, it seems as though that it's implying that there was an intention of something bigger than actually happened. And oftentimes we find ourselves where there's only so far that people will go. I mean, even in discipleship, we experience that with people. I call it the glass ceiling of discipleship, where they only grow so far.
Yeah.
Or their circumstances, they allow their circumstances to like using the example of the soil, to strangle, to restrict follow through. So I think that's in there, and it's often overlooked because people want to have a clean break, probably with the call of Abraham himself.
Yeah.
Abram, but
and again, the chapters and verses were added much, much later by a monk, like in Europe. So, these stories run together in the original scrolls of Genesis. So it's kind of arbitrary that we have the end of chapter 11, the beginning of chapter 12. Those are things that we have put in much, much later, thousands of years later.
Yeah, but also
I like what you're saying, though, about this discipleship thing and how sometimes we kind of feel like we can't grow anymore. And there is something about that here. Terah leaves Ur with the intention of going to Canaan, but he never makes it. So God has to call his son to finish the journey that Terah began. But this time, Abram's called. We don't know why Terah was called. Maybe God spoke to him. We don't have that story. But we know why Abraham leaves Haran.
Mm-hmm.
Like, God is asking him to go, and it's a clean cut with his family. Now, it's like the rich young ruler in that way. But Abraham does take livestock with him. He more or less takes his inheritance. Now, the question is that obedience? Like, do you think Abraham should have gone penniless? He doesn't go penniless. How do you respond to that? I know you might not have thought about that before. It's one of the questions I like to ask people when they read this. When God tells him to leave his father's household and his kindred, Abraham does not interpret that as leaving all of his inheritance behind. But should he have?
Part of me is like, yeah, it would be great for a clean break, but I also know that I mean, if you read further on, you see that everywhere Abraham goes, he's blessed. So I mean, even though he does make some bad decisions, the part of me wants to think that I know also in that culture, correct me if I'm wrong, but even if your father was the higher part, your father was always your father. I'm wondering if Abraham or Abram became to that point where he was old enough that his father made himself subservient to Abram. And so you know what I'm saying? Like, there's a
yeah. If that was the case, and Abraham has become head of household by this point, it would be strange, though, wouldn't it, to call him to leave his father?
It might be, yeah.
My impression is that his father is still strong and healthy.
Vital. by a
That's my instinct. But yeah, you don't really know. It's funny how the story of the prodigal son comes up many, many times. Jesus has a way of telling a parable that recapitulates so many stories of Israel. And you never know which side of it you're going to be on. But from Terah's perspective, Abraham might have looked like a prodigal son. He's asking for his inheritance and he's going to leave and go to a far off country. That's exactly what the prodigal son does. Of course, the prodigal son goes and lives wickedly. Abraham goes in response to God and is blessed. But it's interesting how, from Terah's perspective, Abraham would have looked like a prodigal son, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I think obviously too, most of the time, like if we're comparing it to the rich ruler or however old he was, it doesn't matter. I think the issue there's something about there was the wealth.
Yeah.
That was constricting the growth. Where here in this point, I don't get the feeling that Abraham was restricted by his possessions. And so I mean, from a ministerial perspective, I know that there's people who've gone to college and had all these loans and had all these things they're responsible for. Oftentimes, never even think about it being called of God. That burden that of debt. This is debt. This is not surplus.
Right.
Abram had surplus. But the effectiveness of being able to minister under loads of great debt is foolish in some ways and constricting. So in some ways, I don't feel like it's wrong that he brought that stuff with him, unless he was like pivotal, like taking all of his father's livelihood.
Yeah, I doubt that he would have. My sense is he would have probably taken his inheritance with him. And that's how he interpreted it. It's just interesting that the abandonment of father's house and all that, Abraham could have read that very extremely and left just penniless. But that's not what he does. He takes his servant with him, Eliezer, as he'll come into the story. He takes sheep and goats, and Lot goes with him as well, who was his brother's son and would have been his brother's inheritor. So you might even say he took both birthrights with him. So it's interesting. I'm not casting any dispersion on Abraham. I just think but I do want to insist that Abraham's faith is not yet where it will be.
Yeah.
And that I want to insist. That's why I'm bringing this up. Mm-hmm. Because Abraham hedges his bets. He follows God's call, but he doesn't do it at great risk to himself. He has surrounded himself with a lot of cushion. Mm-hmm. Now, by the time we get to Genesis 22, that Abraham is history. Mm-hmm. He's an entirely different person. I've sometimes postulated that if Abraham was who he was in chapter 22 and 12, he would have not taken anything with him. Mm-hmm. But in 12, he didn't know who this God was. And that's important for us to discuss. He comes from a polytheistic culture, originally from a city that worshiped the moon. He's not said to know who God is. This God just comes to him. He's a polytheist, so he might not have been shocked that a God spoke, but he doesn't know this God. And so God says, go, and he does follow. Mm-hmm. But he follows carefully. That's my point. He doesn't follow with great abandon. He follows, takes his flocks, takes his herds, takes his nephew, and goes. And his family was already on that journey. They just stopped in Haran. So he had already experienced that move from Ur to Haran. So the move from Haran to Canaan, not an enormous leap of faith for Abraham. And that's important because this covenant is one God makes. It's not based on Abraham. And so I'm always curious how people will read in deep faith in this chapter. I would say, yeah, there's faith. I mean, he trusted this voice telling him to go, but he's hedged his bets a lot. And I when you and I first follow God, we hedge our bets too. Hmm. You kind of take some time to really learn what it means for God to take care of you and what he's willing to do and what he's not willing to do. And once Abraham gets to know God, we're going to see a very different response. But this is a very human response. I guess that's what I want to say. Very human response. Where do you want me to go? okay, let me get my portfolio in order and
I'll show you.
we'll transfer the funds and we'll go. And God says, I'll show you where to stop. Now there's only so far he could go. The Mediterranean Sea is, he's going to stop somewhere between there and the Mediterranean Sea.
It does end up in Egypt.
He does for a little while, right? Because of a famine again. Obviously, that's a theme.
Yeah.
That runs throughout Genesis.
And ignore that with Joseph and Jacob.
Yeah.
What
do you make of this covenant he makes with him, or this agreement? Obviously, it's unilateral. He doesn't ask anything from Abraham other than that he leave Haran. But he says, I'll make of you a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all families, the Hebrew is goyim, all Gentiles of the earth shall be blessed, all nations.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the covenant I think most of us grew up wishing God would make with us.
Right. It sounds pretty positive.
You know how many Christians have claimed this, especially nation-building Christians?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what do you make of it?
Well, I think he's got to be asking himself, I have one wife, I have a nephew, and to take that little inventory kind of thing. The question has to be in his mind, like, what are we doing here? What's going to actually result as a result of that? It sounds great. It sounds great to have a large, because back then, large families or more offspring you had, the more it showed the blessing of God.
Right.
But to say that he's going to be a great nation, he's got to be asking himself, well, that's quite an amazing comment to make.
Yeah, a great, especially, we're going to find out later. Obviously, this is a little spoiler alert. Abraham has no children.
Yeah.
And he's really old. He's no spring chicken when God comes to him.
Right. Right.
And his wife's been barren their whole life.
Right.
So it is quite an unusual promise to make to a man in that situation.
Right.
Yeah.
It is an unusual situation.
So it'll be a great nation. That's the Hebrew word is goy,
mm-hmm.
which we get the word Gentile from. Goyim are the Gentiles. So he'll be a great nation, a great goy. God will bless him. That's from the word barak, which means to bless. The word has been used earlier in Genesis when God blessed the earth, right? So this is good. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. So name in the ancient world is reputation, character, value. So he's going to increase Abraham's value in the world. Now, of course, we know he does that by giving Abraham a relationship that no one else has and wisdom that comes through that relationship that no other nation has ever received. So the greatness is not necessarily the way a normal human would think of it, but he is indeed going to do this. So your name great. The purpose of giving him a great name is so that he can be a blessing. Right. That's the way that it's structured. And all those who bless Abraham will be blessed, and the ones who curse him will be cursed. And in you all families of the earth, all the goyim, all nations will be blessed by God. It's quite a promise.
Right. It is. I can't help but think that maybe the idea of in comparison to what we talked about with the Nephilim, the great ones, right? They were often called the people of the renown.
Yeah, men of renown.
The people of the name.
Yep.
They did a great name for themselves.
Yep.
That has to be almost a contrast here.
And then you missed the flood discussion because you're on vacation, but the same thing, not the flood, the Tower of Babel discussion, but the same thing comes up there. The reason they build that city is to make a name for themselves.
Right.
So that's recurrent. You're absolutely right. The Nephilim and the men of renown, the Tower of Babel and making a name. And now Genesis 12, I will make your name great, God says. Everything else, they were making their own names great. Here God says, I will make your name great.
So it's the blessing is that his name is being uh, associated with God rather than it being associated with man, or from man's own effort, should we say,
Right.
in comparison.
And if we're reading this in context, the reason that they wanted to build this city at the Tower of Babel, the reason they wanted to build that city is so that they would not be scattered. They would make a name for themselves and they would not be scattered across the face of the earth. It has to do with preserving who they are.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about Abraham's call is that God has promised to make a great name for Abraham, so Abraham would be remembered. And that is most certainly true. We are still speaking his name. We don't know any other names from that time period in history, 2500 BC or so. We don't know anybody else. But we know Abraham, so God was right. But in order for Abraham's name to be great, he first had to be scattered. That's the opposite impulse of the Tower of Babel. They felt in order to make their name great, they had to be camped in one place. But God invites Abraham to pursue a great name by leaving. It's a very different mentality. And Abraham is going to have to follow God and leave behind his established place if we want his name to be great.
Yeah, it tends to remind me, like I was saying, of the Genesis passage where it talked about leaving and cleaving. The concept of and in this circumstance, it's like cleaving to what God is saying to him. It's a lot of times what they call a ministry is like, is where people have in order for them to be able to realign with what God is saying, they have to actually leave in order to do it. I mean, Jesus said himself, a prophet's not honored in his own hometown. And I think there's a reality there of challenge, of commitment and resolve to have to leave. It's not easy to. I mean, we know from experience because we're ministers, but other people have dealt with that too. It's I go home and they still call me Joey. Or you go home and maybe you have some people that still call you by what you were called when you were young. I mean, really young. I mean, like, these are like from caravan leaders. You know what I'm saying, from years back. But the concept of leaving in order for your faith to develop and grow is, I think, really, really, really large here, really important and foundational. I think oftentimes what we want to teach in the church is that all you need to do is believe in Jesus and just trust in Jesus, and you have your sins forgiven, but forgetting that this is what this call has done for me, is changed the way I understand what it means to be a Christian. Is not to make a name for myself, but to be a blessing to other people. And we actually, when we visit people or we go to see people, that's a physical prayer that as a family that we pray to be a blessing to those around us and not a curse.
Yeah, and you're bringing in, actually, maybe intentionally or maybe not, the idea of marriage, because you've mentioned it a couple times in Genesis, where a man has to leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. It is interesting that in asking Abraham to leave his family, there are probably marital connotations there. With God is actually asking Abraham. It's not surprising that eventually the children of Abraham, who are children of Abraham not just ethnically but by faith, will be called the bride of Christ. So I think you're right to see this kind of almost marital metaphor working here as well. The man has to be called out of his house to cleave to his wife. And there is a sense in which Abraham is being asked to leave behind his culture and to cleave to a new being, cleave to the God of all creation.
As the narrative comes together too, we see that he has to try to sort some of that stuff out. We obviously see some of the decisions with Hagar, some of the move further on. We won't try to spoil all that stuff too, but there are some things he has to really sift out and try to deal with in his faith. It's not like it's all carved out in front of him.
Let's look at verse 4 as we continue kind of thinking, because that was the covenant God made with him. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old. 75. This guy left home. Most of the time by 75, people don't want to move, but he left. 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, I probably should have a map up, but I didn't prepare that in advance so that people could see kind of where we are in Israel. Yeah. But Israel is kind of a long, narrow country. Shechem is in the middle of what's called the hill country. So there are a couple of routes you can take through Israel, and because they weren't blasting with dynamite in these days and stuff, they didn't just make roads wherever. You need to have kind of natural walkways. So there's a north-south road that runs fairly close to the Mediterranean Sea. In older reference books, it was called the Via Maris, the Way of the Sea, but that's a bit of a misnomer because it's not right on the ocean. It's a distance away, but it runs through the coastal plain. There's another route that runs north to south through the hill country. You can access it by either coming up through the pass where Jericho was and up to a plateau where Benjamin was, and then you can walk up that way. Or you can access it by coming up through Galilee and then coming down south. And Jesus often did that. He would follow this road. It went right through, in those days, Samaria, where the Samaritans lived. That's about where Abraham is, about in the region in Jesus' day of Samaria. So he must have come up from Haran, come up through Galilee, and then started a southern journey along the hill country in central Israel, because he's come to Shechem, and that's where that would be. And it's there that the Lord appears to him. This would have been later in the tribe of Ephraim or Manasseh, one of Joseph's sons anyway. I would have to look at a map to tell you precisely which one of those tribes, but it's either Ephraim or Manasseh. So in any case, that's where he is. He's heading south. Now, Abraham is eventually going to end up in what would later be the tribe of Judah, what in his day are called the Negev, where a king named Abimelech lives. But right now, he's just starting that journey. So my best guess, if anybody can look up a map of Israel, is he's come up through Galilee and he started a southern journey through the hill country, which would be just west of the Jordan River. And he stopped at Shechem, and he came to this oak, which is a significant oak tree. It comes up throughout the book of Genesis. Yeah. And there the Lord appears to him. And I would like to know, well, I'm sorry, he builds an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then from there, he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel. So he's continuing a southern journey. Bethel is just north of Jerusalem.
Yeah, it also means house of God, right?
Means house of God. It's not actually called this yet in Abraham's day. It's actually his grandson Jacob who's going to name it Bethel. But for the sake of us knowing where it is,
it helps us for a point.
It helps us, that it's not named Bethel at this time. But he's continuing a southern journey through Israel, and then pitches his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, another significant city that the Israelites get routed by when they try and come back they beat Jericho, and then they are defeated at Ai because a man named Achan has idols in his house. So another significant city. And there he builds another altar at Bethel, in between Bethel and Ai, and invokes the name of the Lord. And then he travels into the Negev, which is, now he's finished the southward journey. He's in what would later be the tribe of Judah. So that's the journey. It's there that they hit a famine. In the Negev, a famine occurs, and that's what sends him to Egypt for a little while, but we'll get into that in another week. So this is the journey that Abraham takes. So I just want to make sure people understand where we are geographically and what's occurring. But he pretty much gets a tour of the whole land of Canaan, at least the major hill country part, which would have been forested in these days. Nowadays, you look at Israel, you couldn't imagine a forest anywhere. But in Abraham's day and all the way up through David's day, this is a forested region of Israel till he gets to the Negev, which is a little more arid.
You know, one of the things that first pops out to my mind is like the concept of those who were in the line of Seth, like Enoch and Noah, walked with God. This here is a physical picture of Abraham walking with God.
And now, that's such a good pull, Minister Joe, because we didn't know what it meant to walk with God. We were just told that they did. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right, and I never thought about it before. This might be the answer to that question. What does it mean to walk with God? Well, God told him to leave Haran.
It's to walk among the oaks.
Yeah, and he went, and he comes down and makes a couple of altars to this God. He's claiming the land for God. You see, like in the ancient world, you had to invite a god to inhabit a place. That's the way they thought about it. That's what the Tower of Babel was all about. Lucas and I discussed it. They would build a ziggurat with the intention of God coming down. So Abraham is basically making this land holy. So it's ruled by the Canaanites, but he doesn't conquer the Canaanites. He doesn't go to war, but he does build altars all along the road that leads through it. He's pretty much marked out the north, the central plateau, and the south. He makes an altar at each one of those locations. So Abraham is marking his territory with altars to the God who called him in the midst of other people owning it.
Yeah, physically describing the last verse of chapter 4, which is, then they called upon the name of the Lord.
They called on the name of the Lord
in those days. And so I mean, it even says it here in the verse 9. No, yeah, verse 9, where it says there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. That's actually 8. Sorry. So to me, it's like that's a regrouping of that.
All the way back to Genesis 4, I agree. In those days, man began to call on the name of the Lord. And Enoch walked with God and was no more. Noah walked with God and survived a flood. And now we have a man called to walk with God. Yeah. And he is doing what those who walk with God do. They follow God's command and they call on the name of the Lord.
Right, yeah. So
prayer and obedience.
Yeah, I was going to just emphasize that with Noah. He did everything. He says it several times the Lord commanded him to do. You know what I'm saying? So in some ways, Abram is doing both of those things. Walking with God.
It's a good start.
And doing everything that's commanded. Leaving. Which it's a little harder than well, is it harder than building an ark? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, leaving is... It's terrifying if you've never done it. Well, we're experiencing it right now, right? For 3 months, we've been locked up. And people have told us we should be terrified to leave our homes. And now I know things are tightening up in other parts of the country, but here in New York, we were the epicenter of the beginning of this thing. And so now things are starting to open up slowly in New York. I know that that's not the experience of everybody. Some people are just now locking down. But we're starting to open up, but you find there's a lot of fear in people. They're not sure what it will be like to go out there and the risk and the vulnerability and can I be safe? And that's understandable, right? If you've ever moved, like really moved, not just gone to college and come home on the summers, but if you've really left home and gone to some place where you don't know anybody and started over, it's terrifying. That's a very vulnerable experience. You and Tammy, we're now celebrating your 1-year anniversary. You knew Jennifer and myself, but not deeply well. I mean, we knew each other. We had interacted with each other. You had interviewed for a position I was hiring for a few years ago at a different church, and we ministered alongside each other. I went to camp, and you built me a campfire for my board. and you made sure everything was running while we were there. So we knew each other. You had listened to me preach, but we didn't know each other really well. But you knew somebody. But when you went to Windsor, you didn't know anybody.
That's right. That's right.
So I think ministers get a sense of this, but people have to do this a lot. Where they have to leave home and really leave and start completely over. That's terrifying. It's a very exposing experience. And for that to be your first communication with God, that's a hard request.
Yeah.
But Abraham does it.
And also the idea of the oaks, we actually had maps and deeds for the camp that we were at that actually had 50 paces to this large tree, and then a rock wall over here. Those kinds of landmarks
Yeah.
to describe the areas. And you just think about what you said there was some significance to the oaks of or the old tree.
You're right. You're absolutely right to point out this is an old way of making maps, significant landmarks. And that's what's being done here. The Israelites who read this would have known these landmarks.
Sort of like the sequoias in in California.
Yeah.
They're huge.
Right.
You couldn't drive by them and not notice.
Well, if you've ever lived anywhere for a long period of time, you'll have these kind of landmarks, right? And some natural landmarks change much less frequently than human-made landmarks do. Like if we had this place when I was growing up called the Fair, which was a store. But that thing, I think to this point, has been 5 or 6 different stores by now. So you can't use that as a landmark. But some of the natural features of the land have not changed through my entire life. So we can still say, even though the whole landscape has changed, you can still say, you remember that big old tree? Or do you remember that river? Or do you know where the canal is? Those things are still there. So in the old way of making maps was by significant landmarks, and that's what's happening. You're absolutely right. Just like your Windsor map. You're orienting. But Abraham's doing something very unusual, and this is a huge act of faith. He is building altars to his God in other people's territory. That's the point of saying the Canaanites were still ruling the land. That's got to be risky to build an altar in somebody else's territory, because each of the Canaanites would have had their own local deity, and they would not want that God to be offended.
Yep.
So Abraham he's more or less saying, this is my land. I mean, this is the God that's called me. It's his land. And I'm going to put an altar here in the north. I'm going to put an altar here in the center, right along the major trade route. And then I'm going to set up camp in the Negev. That's an act of faith. So even though Abraham, I said he's hedged his bets, he's taken a lot of wealth with him, he's also taken some risks. I mean, it's a good beginning.
Yeah. He's making a statement for sure.
Yeah.
Making a statement of, you have an altar, you sacrifice on it, something on there. I think people are going to notice.
Yeah.
Going to notice them.
And I want to ask you this, Minister Joe, because we're kind of getting to the end of this part. I don't want to get into what happens when they're in Egypt. But how do you respond to the fact that he does all this, leaves home, travels through this land, calls on the name of the Lord 3 times, builds altars? Next thing that happens, famine. If he doesn't get out of there, he's going to die. Is that how you thought it would go?
Not exactly. It's not the pyramid of success.
I mean, it's common in this region, so I'm sure it wasn't that a surprise to Abraham. But when you do all that, and God says he's going to bless you, I don't think the first thing you think you'll discover is starvation.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily think that was probably starvation for him. That might have been a type of judgment for the people who were there.
Right.
And it's not uncommon for God to do that, to judge his people.
But here the man he's going to bless is affected by it for whatever its reason.
Well, he's definitely going to bless him because he comes back from the southern border with more than he had.
He does. Yeah. So, but I guess the reason I bring that up is I think a lot of the time we follow Jesus or follow God's call, whether it's out of a particular set of sins or a particular set of loyalties, or in more extreme circumstances from a geographical location to another. However it is we follow him, we often expect to find, when we arrive where he's asked us to go, something at the end of the rainbow. Something worth having left all that for. But many people discover that things are harder after following God than they were before. Yeah. The Israelites find this after they're delivered from slavery. What's the common complaint of Israel in the wilderness? We had it better in Egypt.
Yep.
And Abraham certainly had it better in Haran.
Yeah.
And we should expect that. It's not surprising that that's the experience of people. But Abraham's story, as you've already said, the initial period of suffering that makes him have to abandon the land not long after arriving there ends up working to his benefit. But it's not obvious that that would be the case.
Yeah, it's human wisdom that usually draws us to those conclusions. It's sort of like you make an investment, you expect for it to increase. Nobody makes an investment to get a loss.
Right.
Take a loss. I mean, that's not the common thread. But I know from ministry experiences that a lot of the time when you make sacrifices and risks because you're following God, you're not going to always personally gain from it.
Yeah.
But there is an inner joy or peace that comes that's harder to explain.
Yeah.
And to those who don't appreciate that usually don't get it. They don't understand it. It's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But it's also it really comes up to an old Steve Taylor song that I used to know. I used to like Steve Taylor a lot.
Mm.
It's harder to believe than not to, kind of mentality where it's like God's calling you to do something, and sometimes it's just totally counterintuitive to what you would think.
Right.
You'd be like, this is crazy. But in the end, you know that you're doing what God wants you to do.
Yeah. And I've often asked myself, how did Abraham know? How did he know he could trust this God? And there's no answer to that in the text. But God takes it very, very slow with Abraham. Well, he's Abram at this point. He's going to be named Abraham. So his name meant father in both cases. But Abraham makes his name mean father of many peoples rather than just our father. So he's taken a huge leap of faith. It's at some cost to him, and it goes poorly right away. That's, I think, all important elements of this early stage of Abraham. Now, things are going to turn around for him pretty quickly. But at first, I often wonder what his initial experience was.
Yeah, and I think that it could, and how can I say this particularly? It could be that in order for us to appreciate the blessing, we have to see some of the curse.
And
part of the promise as part of this revelation.
And there's a way in which, when we follow God, like let's say, I'll just put a hypothetical. Let's say Abram followed God to Canaan, and he found that all the people had mysteriously abandoned the land. There was wealth everywhere, vineyards, planted crops, built houses, and everybody was gone. And he just inherited it. I imagine he could have thought, well, there's nothing miraculous about this. I could have come here by myself. Like, God often likes to show us the reality before he answers the prayer. We have to be fully aware of the situation. He likes us to know. So eventually they will supplant all these people, and they will inherit all of their stuff. But Abraham doesn't come and get all that. God wants us to see what he's actually doing. And for us to see it, we have to see what the world is without him.
He does say, I will show you.
The land I will show you. And God does. He shows them the land. And it's all taken by other people. It's all inhabited. But he does show it to them.
Can you imagine going to a restaurant and you're like, we have reservations. We've been promised a table. You look in here, there's not a table in sight.
Yeah.
We have a reservation.
This reminds me of the story. I don't know if you ever heard the story of how Gordon College ended up leaving Boston and ended up on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It used to be in Boston. That's how ENC and Gordon were rivals early on. They were both in the city.
Okay.
But I was at Gordon, so I had to tell this story so many times. It was one of my responsibilities for one of the scholarships I had to tell new families this. So it's sort of ingrained. But there's a story of a young guy who went to school in the city, and there's a T-stop, a train stop for those who've never been to Boston, right down the road from where Gordon is. And this kid would walk from his house or wherever he lived all the way down this road that passed the present property of Gordon and go to this T-stop and take the train into the city to go to school. And as he was walking down that road one day, he felt the Lord was telling him that that property belonged to Gordon. So being a young whippersnapper, he walked right up to the main house of the person who owned all that land, knocked on the door and said, God, more or less, God told me that this land is for our college. And the man kind of sloughed it off. But, and I don't remember all the details of the story. It's been so many years since I've told it. But in that man's will, he left all that land to Gordon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they moved to the North Shore. But it reminds me, like, this is Abraham, right? He's walking by somebody else's property.
Yeah.
And God's saying, this is going to be yours. You know? Yeah. So he puts down his little stakes.
He didn't even ask for it. That's the thing.
No, yeah, Abraham wasn't seeking. Well, I don't know why Terah left Ur to go to Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what that motivation was. We're just not told. But Abraham wasn't asking. Yeah. Any final words, Minister Joe, as we wrap up this opening story of Abraham? I think we've dug pretty deep into it.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think it's worthy for us to understand that, like you referred earlier about people using these verses to describe their circumstances. I'm pretty careful about how people like to say those kinds of things about blessings and curses, and freely saying those things with they think they have the empowered ability to be able to say what's to be cursed and what's to be blessed.
Yeah.
But I want to emphasize so much. I feel it's important to emphasize the issue of our heritage in Abraham is to be a blessing, to be the offspring, and to realize that how vital that is, to be in the image that people have used of the Jordan River or the Sea of Galilee being a waterway as opposed to the Dead Sea. It just receives.
Right.
And that's so vital, I think, for us to understand. And some of that means that we have to be able to let go of our resources.
We have to be really careful, as you're saying, that, remember, Abraham didn't become Abraham because he wanted to be Abraham. He didn't pursue greatness only to have it delivered by God. It's God who initiated this with Abraham. And Abraham is unique. He's unique in the history of humanity. We have to be very careful, and I think this is what I hear you saying, that we don't read ourselves into the hero role of every story.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be very, very careful about that. We have to let Abraham be unique and not try and claim his promises for ourselves. We have to be careful of that. But we have to recognize what in Abraham's character and in his responses were pleasing to God, because we can certainly recognize these as healthy ways to interact with God, even if the promises made to Abraham are not made to you or to me. And they're not. They're made to Abraham. You and I have become part of this olive tree by faith in Jesus. But that's very different than this original call of Abraham to an individual person who lived in the ancient Near East around 2500 BC. And when we read the scriptures, as deep as we dig, we have to be careful we don't always cast ourselves in the role of hero. There can be a temptation to want to be Abraham, to want to be Jacob, to want to be Joseph, to want to be Judah, to want to be David, and to claim the promises made to these individuals as though they're made directly to me. But there are a lot of side characters in these stories as well. Like Terah, Abraham's father, remains in Haran. Maybe sometimes you and I are Terah. Sometimes we're Esau. Sometimes we're not the hero. That's my point. And so when we're reading the scriptures, one bit of advice that I would give, and I think this at least dovetails with what you were saying there, Minister Joe. So be very careful we don't cast ourselves in the role of the best character and then claim all those promises for ourselves and think that we've been given some sort of authority. That's a good warning for ministers, but it's a good warning for all people who follow God.
Yep.
There are as many bad examples in the scriptures as there are good ones. And loathe that we think we always belong in the role of the good example.
Yeah, we have to be careful too, not to make this the model for everyone to follow.
He's unique.
God's leading. Yeah, I mean, of having to leave everything.
So how would you know, Minister Joe? This is a good question. I have some thoughts too, but I'm genuinely curious. How would you know, from your own perspective, that a certain life in the scriptures can be taken as a pattern? How would you know?
Well, I think that you have to be able to step back for a second and ask yourself, is that the point of what's being said? Is to be the model. And I don't think that's the point of what's being said here, is to say that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord, this is what you will experience. So I think it's unique to Abram, because this is what we find. We don't find this everywhere else. We do find the calling of Isaiah and calling of Jeremiah, but they're not the same kinds of things that we see here. But we do see that God calls people, and so that's what the way I would answer it. I would say that to say that this is the way God works in every circumstance is to put, like, I forget the person who wrote that book, but to put God in a box.
Yeah.
Say this is the only way He works, is not helpful for people who don't experience it that way.
Yeah.
And
For me, I'm very similar. I think you're saying this more or less, and I would say it's the repetition, the repeated elements that begin to become a model. Like if every person God ever called God made those same promises that He did to Abraham. Like let's say that was repeated over and over again, and pretty much in the scriptures you have a pattern that whenever God makes an agreement with anybody, it always comes with the same blessings. Then you might say, okay, well, this is the nature of how God makes relationships. So if He's making one with me, He must be making this must be implied. So that if it was repeated, but you don't find that with Abraham. This idea that I'm going to make your name great, I'm going to make you into a great nation, I'm going to bless those who bless you, curse. These are unique promises to Abraham. You don't see that repeated every time God makes some sort of an overture with an individual. So again, not always. Like for instance, Ezekiel is called into God's service, but there's no blessings at all for Ezekiel. Ezekiel's call is entirely self-sacrifice. Jesus too. It's entirely self-sacrifice. So you want to see the repeated elements. And I think we do see some elements of the Abraham story that are repeated. You said God calls. He does. And when God calls, it's disruptive. That is a repeated element. God almost never calls you to stay exactly as you are, exactly where you are, exactly as you are.
Yeah.
Right?
And we see that not in the calling of the disciples too. You get Matthew left the table, up on the left. There is that calling away from a lifestyle, but there's also the calling of Paul or Saul in Acts is different than those
Exactly.
guys.
But God's call, what's similar is that God's call is generally disruptive.
Mhm.
It generally requires sacrifice. It generally requires faith to enact it. And it often doesn't go well early on. Like those, we see that in the story of Abraham, and that is repeated so many times. I mean, think about David, who's anointed just like Abraham was called. He was, that kind of takes him out of his family. Now he has a different destiny and he has to leave home, just like Abraham did. But he doesn't get the throne right away. He spends like years running for his life and fighting battles. I mean, just like Abraham finds a famine. You know, so I'm saying that we kind of know what is a model of discipleship based on the repetition. And we have to be careful we don't take the unique elements that are very specific to an individual and claim those. So like I've often said this very earnestly, I almost said joked around. It's not a joke to me, but the passage, you know, if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face, right? I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. People claim that for just about everything, right? Anytime, like people are claiming it right now for America. The context there in 2 Chronicles is of the anointing of the temple Solomon built. And what Solomon specifically asks is that God will be attentive to the prayers prayed in this place, and that he'll be attentive to prayers prayed in the direction of this place if the people are sent into exile. And God agrees. And that's the agreement in chapter 7, verse 14, that he will hear the prayers made in this place. But that temple was destroyed. So that promise was made for that temple, and it's gone. Now you might say, but isn't there a principle? Sure, there's a principle. But you can't claim that precise promise, because it was a promise made to one specific building and location about the land of Israel. Now, you can make it an allegory if you want to, but you do it at your peril, because it was deadly literal when it was originally said. So there are principles. Of course, God wants us to repent. Of course, he promises to forgive our sins. But we can't claim the promise made to a specific location. God never made that promise about any other location in history. He never promised this kind of a promise. Even to the second temple, he didn't make this promise.
Right.
And that temple was destroyed. Also, the second temple was as well, not long after the days of Jesus. So the point that you're bringing up, that we need to be careful in how we apply these things to ourselves, is absolutely true. What we are looking for is repeated patterns that help us to see the things that all of God's calling share in common, because those things will be likely to be true of us as well. But we like to claim the unique promises because they're usually the best ones. I mean, I want people who curse me to be cursed. Come on, that's gotta be a good one. But sorry, not Abraham.
Yeah, well, it's probably a bit confusing because people are probably pulling that from the Sermon on the Mount.
In what way do you think?
Where there's this idea, you know, you pray anything in my name, and I give you the power to bless those who you want to bless, and curse those who you want to curse. It's probably where people are trying to draw some of that from, and yet they're still missing the point.
Yeah, because anything you ask in my name, and we covered this in a recent sermon, means anything you ask according to my character, anything consistent with who I am. That's what a name means. And so once that gets out to Gentiles and all, John has to specify in 1 John, anything you ask according to his will, which is a synonymous way of saying anything you ask according to my name. Like that, they mean the same thing. But the first audience, maybe he expected to be a little more Jewish oriented and know what that meant. The second audience, he's pretty sure they wouldn't understand it. So
Right.
yeah, but again, God doesn't say to Abraham, you can have anything you want if you ask me.
Right.
He just says, I'm going to make your name great. So, and Jesus does, you've mentioned this as well. He makes a promise to his disciples that whatever they loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, whether they bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And he's also said, whoever you forgive on earth will be forgiven in heaven. Again, I'm not sure that those connect with the Abraham promise, but they are important promises.
I'm just saying people are angling those, could be using those to angle
to try and say there's a pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
But
I don't
again,
agree with it. Obviously.
once you read, you'll notice differences though, because this is not a promise that Abraham can bless anybody.
Right.
It's saying that God is going to take vengeance on those who don't stand with Abraham. I would say that the true children of Abraham are children of faith. Romans 9. And so if this applies to anybody, it may apply to the church, the true church, which is a combination of the natural branches of Israel and grafted in Gentiles, who become the olive tree of Israel, the true inheritors of Abraham.
Yeah.
So the world at its peril curses the church, I would say. But I don't think any of us can individually take this anymore. What was individual to Abraham has become corporate.